Now on BBC World News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
Stacking up nicely, the US adds way more jobs than expected in January, fueling hopes about the fight against inflation. Gautam Adani says claims of fraud at his business empire are baseless, as the speculation around the Indian business giant leads the central bank to reassure investors. Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Jonathan Josephs with all the latest on the global economy. We start in the United States, where we've had an indication that the world's biggest economy might be in better health than many economists had thought. That's because of a higher than expected 517,000 jobs being added in January. It will reassure the central bank, the Federal Reserve, that its increases in interest rates, of which we had just one more this week, aren't putting companies off from investing in the future as it continues its fight against inflation. Well, let's get more on this and go to New York and bring in Samira Hussain, our correspondent who's there for us. Samira, which parts of the US economy are adding all these jobs?
First, I think we really need to talk about just how blockbuster this number is. We're talking the U.S. economy in the month of December added 517,000 jobs. The expectations were that jobs that were going to be added were going to be in the 185,000 range. There's lots to parse out here. First, how is it that economists got it so absolutely wrong? And to your point, JJ, or to your question, JJ, where are all these jobs coming? A lot of the hiring has been happening in the leisure and hospitality sectors, but we're also seeing increases in healthcare and we're also seeing increases in business. And it's really such an eye-watering number, especially when you consider the fact that many people believe that the U.S. economy is headed for a possible recession. Remember that the Federal Reserve, that's America's central bank, wants to see evidence of this job market cooling, that the labor market is just too tight, and that they want to see some of that cooling happening. The fact that we saw the last few labor reports showing that kind of cooling gave the Federal Reserve a little bit more confidence. But now this is really going to throw a lot of things into question because you have such a varied picture of the U.S. economy right now.
So this puts Jerome Powell, the head of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, puts him in something of a dilemma, doesn't it? Because he was urging caution after this week's decision to increase interest rates again. What does the Federal Reserve do from here if it's going to navigate its twin mandate of keeping people in jobs but also controlling inflation?
Right, and that's forever the question because there's such a mixed picture when it comes to the state of the U.S. economy. So we saw in December that consumer spending is starting to slow. Remember, that kind of spending is actually a big driver for the U.S. economy. In the fourth quarter, so that, the quarter that ended in December of 2022, we only saw a growth of about 1% in the United States. But now you sort of smush that with this blockbuster jobs report. It's really questioning what it is that the U.S. Federal Reserve should be doing in its way forward with that dual mandate. It's really interesting, especially since this week we also already heard from the U.S. Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who did say that, look, we're cautiously optimistic. We're cautiously optimistic about potentially avoiding a rough landing for the U.S. economy. We're cautiously optimistic about our fight with inflation, but this is certainly going to change things for them.
And Samira, just briefly, you spoke of a mixed picture there, and these jobs are essential for US consumers having money to put in their pockets to spend with the likes of Amazon, Apple and Google's parent Alphabet. But they've all had their latest financial results and saying they're not very optimistic and things weren't looking so good. So just briefly, where does that leave us?
Well, I think with the tech companies, it is a bit of a mixed picture, too. Amazon depends heavily on people spending money. If people are nervous about the economy, they're not going to spend as much, which is why you saw that Amazon is being a little bit halting in terms of what it expects going forward. It's also grappling with the high U.S. dollar. The strong U.S. dollar is going to have an impact on its business. If you look at Google, the parent company Alphabet, you see that, look, that's a company that depends heavily on advertising. We know already across the board, corporate America is reining in some of its hiring. But then throwing that all to the wind, you look at Meta, which had blockbuster, even though it had pretty fair results for the last quarter, because it's implementing so much cost cutting, their stock price jumped by 25% in trading yesterday.
Samira Hussein in New York for us. Thanks very much for the latest on the US economy. Now let's turn to India, where the central bank has taken the unusual step of saying that the country's banking sector remains, quote, resilient and stable. It comes amid ongoing speculation about the financial health of the Adani Group. It's one of the country's biggest business empires and is controlled by Gautam Adani, who is one of the world's richest men. Mr. Adani has told an Indian television channel that claims of fraud at his companies made by a US investment firm are baseless. Well, let's get more on this with Arshana Shukla, who is our India business correspondent and joins us from Mumbai. Arshana, it's getting to the weekend now in India, but even then we've had the central bank getting involved in this very unusual manner. Why have they felt the need to do that?
Well, you know, when one of the large business houses loses about $100 billion worth of market capitalization in just 6 trading sessions, there are concerns being raised about the creditworthiness of the Adani Group. Now, in the last few years, Adani Group has funded most of its high-paced expansions through debt. About $24 billion is the debt exposure on the group company, and a third of that comes from Indian banks, some of which are nationalized banks. In the last few days, when the shares were falling, RBI had reached out to banks to assess their exposure, and now they've come back with a statement to say that the lending from Indian banks has been under the permissible norms and everything is well within limits. But there are certain concerns raised about a contagion in the market, and this statement from the regulator also helps to allay that fear. Concerns have been raised that when share prices have fallen so much, will the company, which has always been over-leveraged, and that has been one of the bigger concerns being raised even in the Hindenburg report, will they be able to make their repayment schedules or not? Credit rating agencies have also increased their scrutiny. However, even they've said that at least in the immediate term, there are no risks so far.
So that's some reassurance for Gautam Adani and his companies. But all of this has been raised in the Indian Parliament in Delhi, and it was some quite heated scenes, weren't there? What were the links to the politics here?
Well, it was always anticipated. Gautam Adani runs a business empire, and as a personality, he has been very close, has close ties with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and his proximity to Prime Minister Narendra Modi has often been under scrutiny. And when one of his biggest business empire shares fall and lose almost half the market valuation, the impact will be on the political side as well. Opposition parties for 2 days in a row have disrupted the parliamentary proceedings, demanding an investigation into the allegations that the Hindenburg report has raised. They are also raising accusations that the government has forced state-run nationalized banks as well as insurance companies like Life Insurance Corporation to invest in Adani companies, and that is jeopardizing citizens' savings. So a lot of political implications over here as well.
Arshana Shukla in Mumbai for us. Thank you so much for the latest on the Adani Group there. Now, the International Monetary Fund has suggested that China will be responsible for about a quarter of the world's economic growth this year in its annual assessment of the world's second biggest economy. It will lead some to once again ask if emerging economies, of which China is still classed as one, will ever challenge the dominance of the mighty US dollar as the world's leading currency. It is a growing possibility, according to Lord Jim O'Neill. He's the former Goldman Sachs banker who came up with the term BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, a group of the world's biggest emerging economies. And he's been telling my colleague Aaron Hazelhurst why it matters.
I guess the biggest thing that it achieves is this constant highlighting of perhaps the inefficient, out-of-date structure of global governance, because particularly China and India have become so big, they're still not really properly represented in the IMF, the World Bank, obviously the UN, and so on. And one of the purposes of their meeting is to constantly highlight to the world that a bunch of big developing countries can get together and talk about things without the rest.
And you can see more of that interview in Talking Business with Aaron Heselhurst this weekend, where he takes a look at the future of the BRICS economies. The times are on your screen now, with the first airing at 22:30 GMT on Friday. Thanks for watching World Business Report.